A lot of us, before using Next.js, were primarily front-end developers, which meant that we used client-only front-end libraries or frameworks such as React or Angular. But then as soon as Next.js got out, all of us jumped ship. And now probably almost all of us are using Next.js, the meta full stack React framework with an inbuilt API route that lets you handle all your backend logic. React server components that allow you to fetch data very easily inside your React components. And now server actions for mutations without ever writing a post endpoint, ever. That is, you don't even need a separate endpoint for that. You can literally write the code for mutation in your client component. So does that mean that all of us have suddenly become full stack developers? Well, I think not. It's because all of us forgot one thing before becoming or calling ourselves full stack developers. That is to learn the actual basics of backend development. And that brings me to the point of this video that most Next.js developers neglect. That is security. You see, the convenience that Next.js offers us means a lot of power. A lot of power in the hands of us developers. And as Uncle Ben used to say,
remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
So we must make sure that the backend code and logic that we are writing inside a Next.js application is more robust, is more secure, if not at par with if you were writing a separate web application or a separate backend. With almost all of us now shifting towards full stack development and everyone wanted to become a full stack developer, it is very important for all of us to think about security, especially when inside Next.js, the lines between server and client are already so blurry. It's very easy for you to accidentally leak secrets and tokens that you shouldn't to the client side. It's very easy for you to expose an endpoint that should probably have a lot of authentication checks before performing an action. So in this video, we'll be seeing how we can actually increase the security apart from the normal authorization checks inside Next.js. Let's go. Before we begin with improving the security of our Next.js application, let's understand the ways in which we can interact with data inside our React components. That is, React components present inside our Next.js applications. So the first approach is simply using HTTP APIs, which is probably the oldest and most old school way of fetching data and mutating data. That is, you have normal APIs written in a separate backend and you call those APIs on your front end. The second approach, which React server component allows us to do, is directly fetch data using an async component. This is very useful in the prototyping stage and can help you get your app launched very, very fast. But there's not the recommended and secure approach. The recommended approach is to actually have a separate data access layer. That is to have a file or a folder where all your data mutation and data fetching logic is written. Anytime you interact with the database or interact with another API, this is where your code should be written. Now, why is this the recommended approach? It is because having all your logic centrally inside a single folder or inside a single file can help you easily audit that file or folder and get a handle of your security very, very easily. Moreover, a separate data access layer allows you to catch any vulnerabilities inside your backend logic very easily. Plus, you can mark all your server-side code, that is all the code that should execute on the server, with an npm package called server only. Import on the top of every file that should run only and only on the server. And anytime by mistake you export any module out of this file that has an import server only, it will throw an error on build. That is, Next.js build won't go through. Apart from that, there is something also known as React Taint, which is an experimental feature inside React, which if you enable, then any objects or values that you return cannot be passed to the client as props. Now, you cannot pass this user data to any client component. It will throw an error, which is just amazing. So there's no way for you to accidentally leak server data, for example, any sensitive data related to your users or any secret tokens that you might have on the client side. Although this does not protect you against extracting data and then sending it, because that would be considered as intentionally exposing data, and that wouldn't at that point be considered as exposing, but rather than actually passing data that is required to the client side. Let's see how we can do it in our Next.js applications. So this is how we typically write a React server component inside Next.js. So we can basically await any API call or any database call directly inside our component, and then use those values inside our component very conveniently. But there are two problems exactly which we need to solve whenever we are working with Next.js, specifically because client and server boundaries are very blurry. So for example, in this case, you have fetched the secret on the server and you accidentally pass it to the client. What do you think is going to happen in that case? That's right, you're going to see the secret key, whatever it is. You are going to see it, and that is the whole problem. So how can we make sure that we don't pass unwanted objects to the client components? So for that, we'll use something known as React Taint. So Taint is currently an experimental feature which we'll need to enable inside our Next.js config, which I've done so. So now to use Taint, we'll be importing the experimental Taint object reference. This will make sure that any object that we are getting is not passed directly to the client. For example, over here I'll be making a small chain and making secret key an object. Now once we have an object, we'll be simply wrapping the secret, that is the object, with the Taint object reference. And now since our return type of our fake API, that is the API to get a secret key, has changed a little bit, we'll also be making sure we don't get a JavaScript error. So we'll be passing in secret.key over here. And over here, instead of calling this out like this, we'll simply be rendering it. We'll simply be logging it out right now. So let's see what happens. Yeah. And just like that, I'm getting a runtime error inside my Next.js application that I cannot expose this secret key. So that makes it very convenient for me to find out if I'm accidentally passing any secret tokens or keys or any unwanted objects to my client side. So one thing to note is that this is not restricted to only objects. This can also be used for values. All of this is fine. But why should I have all my code co-located over here? Rather, the better approach that we discussed, the data access layer, we should shift all our APIs and all our data fetching and mutation logic to a separate data access layer, which is probably a data file or folder. So in this case, we'll be creating a folder called data, which will have an index.ts file. And this is what will contain all our data fetching logic. Why? Why is this beneficial? Why is this useful? Now, for example, consider that you have an other function over here that you are very sure only needs to run on the server side, of course. But this is a normal function, right? And I can very easily run it on my client side as well. It won't cause me any issues. Let's have a look. I'm still passing secret keys, so I'll first have to get rid of that. Yeah, so I'm still seeing this will run only on server function run on my client. And I don't want that definitely. So how can I get rid of that? So wherever we are sure that our code should run only and only on the server side, we should always mark them with the import server only package. So server only is a very basic package which will throw an error if any of the code that is supposed to run on the server side actually ends up running on the client side. Let's install this and let's import it. Now this server only will actually not allow me to build my Next.js project if I'm exporting any function from here or running any function from inside this whole file inside a client component. As you can see, I'm already getting a compile time error over here. that you're importing a component that needs server only, and this will only work in a server component. So I'll have to get rid of this run only on server over here, and only then will I be able to run my client component. So this way, by using the data access layer, that is having all our data mutation and fetching logic in a separate file or folder, and marking it with server only, and using React Taint, we can make sure that we never ever leak any sensitive data from our server to our client accidentally. But what about making sure that we don't expose an unsafe endpoint inside Nextjs? Well, that is something that I'll be covering in the next video, which you can find over here and in the comments below. Yeah, so see you there.